The JH-7A gives China a modern ground attack jet in War Thunder. Let's check it out. The Xi'an JH-7 was the result of a very long project that started back in the 1970s to develop a fully indigenous Chinese strike aircraft. The Nanchang Q-5 was already flying, but had a somewhat small and limited airframe as it was still based on the MiG-19 light interceptor. Well, China went through some pretty serious internal political disruptions during the 1970s, and partly as a result of this, a lot of aviation programs, like basically all of them, were set back by almost a full decade. The new strike jet was no exception, and it wasn't until 1983 that it was put back on track and made a priority. The goals were pretty ambitious: to create a strike aircraft with a meaningful bomb load comparable to a light or medium bomber, with supersonic performance, low-altitude navigation capabilities, and long range. It wasn't until the end of 1988 that the first prototype finally flew, and while the airframe showed potential, most of the systems just weren't ready, and there was still a lot of work to do. By this point, the Chinese Navy had signed on to the project, hopeful to get a jet capable of anti-ship attacks to replace its obsolete fleet of H-5 bombers. The jet went through a highly troubled prototype phase that lasted throughout most of the 1990s, and it was plagued by constant problems with production quality. For example, in one well-known incident, the entire rudder assembly simply fell off the plane in flight at medium altitude. Whoops, don't need that. Eventually, the supply chain quality control issues were fully resolved, the avionics equipment and weapon systems were modernized and fully matured, and in 2004, the definitive JH-7A entered service with both the Chinese Navy and Air Force. The 7A featured the Shenyang J-band radar set, modern air-to-air missiles, and a pretty good variety of anti-ship missiles, as well as an external targeting pod for laser-guided precision weapons. Despite rumors on internet forums, the JH-7A was not a copy of the Jaguar strike jet or the Mitsubishi F-1, and it's completely unrelated to both of those projects, although it bears a superficial visual similarity to both of them. What we get in War Thunder is the JH-7A, a Chinese strike aircraft in Rank 8 with a battle rating of 11.3. This jet has a full ballistics computer for its air-to-ground weapons, the KJ-8602A fully modern radar warning receiver, and it can take a targeting pod with good thermals and a solid optical zoom. Its radar is the JL-10A, which is I-band in the game, which has reasonably good range, an all-aspect pulse Doppler mode, multiple ACM frames, and search angles. For loadouts, the jet can take air-to-air missiles, dumb bombs, rocket pods, or laser-guided bombs. Notably, its best missile, the PL-8, can only be taken on 2 of the wing pylons. The targeting pod also has a dedicated pylon up under the air intakes, so nothing is lost by taking it. The first air-to-air missile you get is the PL-5, and you can take 2 different models. The B and the C both have similar performance in flight. They're both 30G missiles with reasonable range and acceleration. But the C has an all-aspect seeker, can lock targets from farther away, and is generally more capable overall. The PL-5C will be your primary missile while you're grinding upgrades for this jet. Your top-tier missile is the PL-8. This thing is a beast. It has 40 Gs of pull, an all-aspect seeker, reasonable range, strong tracking, and it's faster than the PL-5. The only downside is that you can only take 2 of them at a time. For precision ordnance, you can take 2 sizes of laser-guided bombs, the LS-500J and the LS-1000J. These are both pretty basic laser-guided bombs, with the main difference being that the LS-1000J has inertial tracking and can hit better through losses in laser locks, for example if you fly over a cloud after you drop it. And obviously, the LS-1000J has a larger warhead. The flight performance of the JH-7A is surprisingly good. In fact, it's easily one of the best flying ground pounders in the game. The acceleration is on point up to about Mach 1, the rate of climb is pretty good, and its maneuverability is better than you probably expect, even if it's not crazy. The only area where it really suffers is in absolute top speed. In practice, you're not really going to have this jet up above Mach 1.1 or so during matches, which is mostly just due to the excess drag from ordnance and its poor supersonic acceleration. The engines don't burn fuel as quickly as you're probably going to expect for a top-tier jet, and the lack of a drop tank isn't really any kind of a problem. In fact, unless you're planning to flank out wide on a larger map or something, you might not even need to go out with a full fuel load a lot of the time. Now, to get into the weeds on its agility, there are a couple of things to consider. First, as I always mention in these vids, because if I don't explicitly talk about this every single time, I'll get a bunch of angry comments acting like I didn't know or something. But if you fly out with a huge load of heavy weapons hanging off the plane, your overall performance is going to suffer significantly. If you're trying to dodge SAMs, or if you get sucked into a turn fight while you're still carrying a bunch of, bombs or rocket pods or whatever, you're going to notice a difference, and it might not end well for you. Second, the combat flaps help its agility quite a bit, but they'll rip off at around 700 kilometers an hour, and they increase energy bleed significantly. There is one silver lining though. This jet has a sweet spot for energy retention, and you can maintain a really solid horizontal turn rate at around 540 kilometers an hour with the afterburners on, presuming you don't have a full load of bombs or anything. Generally speaking, the dogfight agility is good enough with careful flying, even if it's not crazy and epic like an F-16 or something. Taking the JH-7A out into air battles seems like pretty typical ground pounder stuff at first, but it can actually go a little deeper. The standard strike jet meta of just flying out to bomb a base, then taking opportunistic air combat on the way back to the airfield works fine with the JH-7A. But the maximum speed ends up being a slight limitation, as fighters with bombs are often going to beat you to the bases just because their maximum speed is a little higher, so you may end up hitting AI ground units a bit more often. That's fine, just be prepared for it. Now, if you want to live dangerously, you can also fly this thing out as a dedicated fighter, especially in a down tier, which is something that a lot of other ground pounders aren't especially good at. The PL-5C and the PL-8 are both really good weapons, and combined with the decent radar set, you can set yourself up for missile kills and dogfight reasonably well, mostly due to the strong engine power. Now, don't get the wrong idea. MiG-29s and F-16s are gonna get ya, but the point is, you don't need to be entirely defensive with this jet. It can be used as a fighter, but just remember, it doesn't get the EEGS, so you're aiming the cannon with a lot of hope and prayer. When you fly this thing out as close air support, that's where the real fun begins, but also potentially some pain. The full ballistics computer makes its weapons pretty easy to deploy in most situations, but if you're diving in for a pass with unguided rockets or something, make sure to pay attention to your speed and don't redline it. The targeting pod you get with the JH-7A is really a standout feature. It has very crisp modern thermals with really good zoom. You can pick out and lock targets with the laser pretty accurately, even at long range. Plus, the larger of your two LGBs, the LS-1000J, has inertial guidance, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is really useful in the current cloud cover meta, where the maps are frequently overcast with broken or solid clouds. So sometimes all you're going to need is a brief window of visibility for a couple of seconds in order to set up an initial target laze and get the bomb going on its way, with occasional updates to the laze as the clouds break. Now, you're still vulnerable to the overpowered Pantsir S1, and you won't have any idea that thing's firing on you, even with this plane's good radar warning receiver. But if you get a match without any of those on the other team, this jet is just a menace as close air support. Final note on that, it can drop its LGBs at supersonic speed. Visually, the JH-7 is kind of a weird-looking jet. The skins it gets are nice, but the area around the cockpit just looks weird, like it's vertically squished or something. The crew sits really down low in the cockpit on this one, which just seems odd for such a modern aircraft. But the paint jobs are still good, so that's not nothing. Landing can be a little awkward at first, especially with its somewhat tall and narrow undercarriage, but after a little practice, this one isn't too bad. You can drop landing flaps at about 550 kilometers an hour and gear at about 500. The air brake is reasonably effective, and it gets a drag chute. Now with the cockpit, I gotta say I'm not a fan. You get a couple of MFDs and a good heads-up display, but the visibility is awful. As I mentioned a moment ago, you sit down really low in the cockpit, and in VR, I constantly found myself kind of standing up a little bit to try and see what the hell was going on. Overall, I didn't like the cockpit with this on the headset. To wrap up on the JH-7A, this jet has excellent laser-guided bombs, powerful and fuel-efficient engines, a good radar warning receiver with a modern weapon system, and it's better in a dogfight than most ground pounders. However, its top speed isn't the best, and it can only take 2 of its PL-8 missiles. The final verdict on the JH-7A is that this is an incredibly well-rounded jet. It's very well suited to close air support, it's not useless in air combat, and it's a solid choice for grinding ground targets in air battles. If you're near the top of the Chinese tech tree, make this a priority. As always, thanks for watching.